Hi, my name is John Chisholm, Director of Solutions Consulting for RiskRecon. Thank you for joining me today for this brief presentation focused on the RiskRecon solution. A number of the capabilities provided by RiskRecon are inspired by FAIR principles, and we'll talk today about how organizations leverage RiskRecon to reduce their cyber risk by automating continuous vendor risk assessments. But before we jump into the solution, let's take a closer look at the landscape and background. The reality is that the perception of risk for most organizations outweighs their preparedness to deal with that risk. A recent Wall Street Journal Pro survey indicates that 70% of organizations see third-party or supply chain risk as a major threat, yet less than 60% feel prepared to deal with it. In addition, 6 out of 10 risk professionals in the financial services industry state that they're managing risk well. Obviously, that indicates that almost half of risk professionals in the financial services industry realize they're not doing a great job at managing risk. Research shows that ripple events, or events involving third parties, are typically 10x or more the cost of single-party data loss events. Now let's take a closer look at RiskRecon's approach to managing third-party risk, and as I mentioned before, how some of the capabilities are inspired by FAIR principles. One of the key reasons why companies use RiskRecon is that RiskRecon helps companies manage risk and not just issues. If you were to look at competing products in the risk monitoring space, the majority of them prioritize the issues that they discover based solely on issue severity. For example, vulnerability ratings and CVSS scores. RiskRecon automatically determines issue severity as well as the asset value of the impacted system and leverages both issue severity and asset value in combination to determine true risk. And now we'll take a closer look at how RiskRecon discovers the risks associated with an organization in an automated fashion, and then aggregates that risk information to provide a complete and thorough risk profile for the company in question. Just as the FAIR principles are not one-dimensional, RiskRecon looks at multiple dimensions of an organization in order to determine where risk exists. This process starts with a detailed IT profiling of the organization. In order to begin this process, all that RiskRecon requires is a company name and domain. Our automation then begins to build a profile for that organization, which includes wholly owned subsidiaries, products, and services, really any component of the organization with a unique web presence that we can use to discover additional assets and information that should be associated with that organization. From there, our automation begins to look for domains, net blocks, and then specifically hosts or internet-facing systems that we can observe and measure to determine where issues may exist. As we discover potential hosts, our automation goes out and collects code data, configuration data, cookie data, header data, really anything we can collect passively from these systems in order to run through our models and signatures and determine where security issues can be identified. It's worth noting that nothing that RiskRecon does requires permission or input from the companies that are monitored. Once the detailed IT profiling of an organization is complete, the next step is to assess the security posture of each of the organization's systems. RiskRecon's approach is unique in that we gather all of our data through direct observation of an organization's systems. As previously mentioned, as we interact with an organization's internet-facing systems, we gather information such as code from pages, configuration data, cookie data, header data. Again, really anything that we can gather directly from an organization's systems to run through our models and determine where issues exist, such as end-of-life software running on a system, broken web encryption, the presence of less than desirable web application security practices and principles. Once this process is complete, we have a better understanding of where security issues exist within an organization's environment. Next, we'll take a closer look at how this might be observed. Here we're looking at a fairly basic example with a standard web page. If you were somebody browsing the web, you might not be aware of security issues that exist on this system. But if we start to look at some of the information collected by RiskRecon, in this case, for example, looking at code collected from the page as well as an HTTP header response, we can start to see things like versions of Apache that are detected on the system, versions of PHP. We can also see, in this case, which CMS system is used, for example, Joomla. This is one example of how RiskRecon can gather data from a system and leverage that directly observed data to determine something like software patching. Then, by intersecting something like CVSS scores and CVE data, we're able to determine the severity of a specific issue that may impact the system. Once a security assessment of a system is complete, we get to the last and arguably most important step in determining the risk associated with an organization, and that's RiskRecon's ability to automatically determine the asset value of a system. Because we have the benefit, as previously mentioned, of going out, directly observing and interacting with the systems that we've discovered and associated with an organization, we have the benefit of looking at certain data characteristics associated with those systems. So RiskRecon has the ability to observe things like the presence of authentication, form fields or other data elements that are collecting non-public data, or the presence of database services exposed to the internet. When RiskRecon identifies these types of data characteristics on a system, again, authentication, the collection of non-public data, we would then classify that system as a high-value asset versus something that may be classified as a lower-value asset, for example, a standalone web page, static web page, brochureware site, or something similar. And it's this combination of security assessment and identification of security issues and automated asset value analysis that allows us to provide a very complete and thorough third-party risk profile for every organization we assess. Now, just as we took a look at an example of how RiskRecon might discover security issues that exist on a system, we'll also take a look at an example of how RiskRecon might automatically determine and discover the asset value associated with a system. A user on the web navigating to the system shown here might not see anything other than a standard web page. But as RiskRecon crawls all of the pages associated with this system and looks at the underlying code, we're able to uncover things like references to login pages, as seen on the left. In addition, we can see and discover form fields, as seen on the right, where we're seeing the collection of data such as a user's name, address, telephone number, and other personally identifiable information. It's this type of information and observation that RiskRecon would use to classify a system's risk value. So now that we've talked a little bit about how RiskRecon identifies issues that exist on systems and also automatically determines a system's risk value, let's now talk about how all of that comes together within the RiskRecon platform to provide you with a clear understanding of an organization's risk posture. What you're looking at on the screen now is an example of RiskRecon's risk priority matrix. On the risk priority matrix, RiskRecon plots each of the issues identified and prioritizes those issues, again, based on true risk. So for example, a priority 1 issue in the upper right-hand corner is considered a priority 1 issue because in this case we have a critical severity issue that's impacting something that RiskRecon has determined is a high-value asset. By prioritizing each issue in this fashion, we're able to provide organizations with a clear understanding of a company's overall risk posture. As you can see from the risk priority matrix on the screen, we're prioritizing all of the issues discovered across an organization's entire footprint. In doing so, we give organizations the ability to efficiently allocate resources to risk. It's very easy to understand which organizations are taking a risk-based approach, for example, organizations with very few issues in the upper right, and which organizations aren't doing a good job of recognizing and managing risk. While this approach helps organizations prioritize and address risk on a per-company basis, the effectiveness of this approach has been further validated when we look at large groups of organizations by industry. What you're seeing on the screen now is a sampling of the distribution of issues discovered by RiskRecon across organizations monitored in various industries. As you can see on the right, organizations in the banking industry typically demonstrate a very low percentage of issues that are higher priority when compared to, say, universities that are less well known for strict regulation and security posture. So leveraging this concept, you'd probably want to do business with organizations that look more like a bank and less like a university when it comes to their tolerance of risk. We're now going to hop into the RiskRecon portal and take a closer look. We've now loaded up the RiskRecon portal. We'll take a look at a sample company and how RiskRecon presents the various dimensions of risk. As a security ratings and monitoring company, RiskRecon provides ratings on all organizations that it monitors. Ratings are provided on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the best and 0 being the worst, at the overall level, the security domain level, as observed here, or the security criteria level. RiskRecon measures across 11 different security domains and 42 different security criteria. Ratings within RiskRecon are based off of an issue rate across the population of systems discovered. So first off, we're going to scroll down to the bottom. And going through the process we talked about before, where RiskRecon automatically discovers the assets associated with the company, starting with just the company's name and domain. As you can see from this, for this particular organization, RiskRecon discovered 219 domains that are owned or operated by the company, 55 net blocks, discovered 234 unique web server implementations, we see hosting across 40 different companies. And across that footprint of domains, NetBlocks, web servers, we've ultimately discovered 590 active internet-facing systems. And it's this population of systems that we're crawling, gathering data from, and observing to determine, again, where issues exist and what the asset value of the systems are that are impacted. So if we were to look at something like software patching, in this case where we see a rating of a 6.7, on the surface, as we look to understand how this organization performs, how they're managing their environment, we can get a quick understanding when we look at the summary metrics. In this case, we've made 358 observations, which means across the systems that we've identified, there were 358 instances where we could determine the type and version of software that was running on that system. 29 of those we've identified as running end-of-life or unsupported software. So overall, this organization has an 8% issue rate when we look at software patching. This is further broken down into security criteria within the software patching domain. The security criteria for software patching are application server, OpenSSL, CMS, and web server patching. As you can see, each has its own issue count, population, and associated issue rate. If we expand out something like application server patching in this case, you can see that RiskRecon provides the version of software, the IP address. Obviously, these have been masked for the purposes of this presentation. Host names, the number of days we've seen that particular issue in the wild, and then as mentioned before, the specific asset value and the severity related to that issue. And it's that combination, again, of asset value and issue severity that helps us prioritize, in this case assigning a risk priority of 1 to the top 2 issues on the list, giving organizations the ability to prioritize and allocate resources to the higher risk issues, as opposed to dedicating resources to lower risk issues as observed here. Now we'll go back to the Overview tab. Scroll down a bit past the security ratings information, and in this case we'll see the first instance of the risk priority matrix within RiskRecon. In this case, this risk priority matrix is specific to the company listed at the top, and here you're seeing a full count of all of the issues discovered. These are all of the issues identified, all technically correct security issues across the entire footprint of the company. These are all of the issues that contribute to the ratings that you see up above. But in this case, we're prioritizing all of these issues, again, based on the severity of the issue and the asset value of the system that's impacted. You can immediately see that this gives companies the ability to prioritize the small percentage of issues that are higher risk and act on those while ignoring or potentially filtering out for the time being issues that are presented as lower risk. If I were to count up all of the issues across all of these boxes, there's roughly 700 to 800 issues across this entire organization's footprint. But again, 17 of those RiskRecon has identified as being particularly high risk. And clicking on any of these issues provides additional information about the issue in question. In this case, I'll click on the host profile, and you can see that this system running an end-of-life version of software has been identified as a high-value asset because in this case we discovered authentication on that system. In addition to providing prioritization of individual issues, RiskRecon gives organizations the ability to create custom risk policies. These custom risk policies are created by system administrators. With risk policy, system administrators can choose the type and risk level of issue that are most significant to your organization, and those policies can then be leveraged to drive behavior throughout the organization. For example, to create custom action plans for companies you're working with, or to trigger custom detailed alerts. And in order to track and report on risk reduction, RiskRecon gives customers the ability to share custom policy-based action plans with their vendors at no cost, no time limits, and no data masking. Thank you for spending some time with me today to learn a bit more about how RiskRecon automatically discovers issues and determines the asset value of systems to identify and prioritize true risk. If you'd like to learn more, please visit www.riskrecon.com or contact us at sales@riskrecon.com. Thank you and have a great day.